It'll be fine.
How long do you
Okay.
think will be the talk?
25 minutes.
Okay.
Half an hour. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome to an Elliott Gordon Presents. And as I mentioned in the past, I'm not doing anything new. I'm doing what Edward R. Murrow did 60 years ago. I'm coming into the living rooms of the stars to speak with them in a warm and intimate setting where they're comfortable, and as a viewer, you're coming into their living rooms with us. 60 years ago, Edward R. Murrow did it with Frank Sinatra and Robert Mitchum and Marilyn Monroe, and last week we did it with Barbara Feldon, and a few weeks ago, Tony Lobianco, and now we have one of, I'm a fan, we have one of really the iconic folk singer writers of one of the greatest music eras in history, the 1960s, and that's Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary. Peter, welcome to my show.
My friend, good to meet you. Yes.
Now,
hello to you too, by the way.
Now, Peter, just to give maybe our younger audiences a little bit of a background that I'm aware of Peter, Paul, and Mary, I think you guys were influenced by a group called the Weavers. Is that the way it started? And then you came together with Noel Paul, which I think is his real name, and then Mary, and then you guys introduced yourselves to the world. But that's your story, not mine.
Right. The question is, as I answered, do you want me to look at you, or do you want me to look at your audience?
Gary, what do you think? Look at Gary. Look at the audience.
Okay, I'm looking at Gary, which is effectively looking at the audience.
Okay.
The group Peter, Paul, and Mary was dramatically influenced by the Weavers, but most of all by Pete Seeger. There were two aspects of the Weavers' music. One was the reality that they sang together, not with kind of identical vocal qualities. You could hear each voice distinctly. For instance, if you heard, the vocal groups from years before and the era before, they blended so much that you couldn't tell whose voice was which. And that maintained the very edgy, very, very clear personality of each of the members. And that was the case with Peter, Paul, and Mary. The second thing, and the most important thing, was that they lived their music in the sense that their music was a powerful instrument for doing what they wanted to do with their lives and with their music. In this case, they wanted the music to be a tool for strengthening the determination of people to make the world a better, more loving, more caring place, specifically in the areas of civil rights at the time that they were singing, before they were blacklisted, in the Joe McCarthy witch hunt trial era.
No, Peter, that's the 50s, is that right?
That's right. That was in the 50s. They stood up for people of color.
Wonderful.
Their politics were about, yes, you would call it the inverse of Donald Trump these days, or the inverse of even those who are more tastefully representing that point of view. But nevertheless, they stood up against the distancing of the haves and the have-nots, so that you have a 1% and a 99%, which it doesn't have to occur. It's, when Peter, Paul, and Mary were first performing after we got very, very successful, our top bracket was 90%.
Wow.
And that was, nobody squawked. That was fair. Now you get kids out of college saying, why should I pay more than somebody who's earning $20,000 a year if I'm earning $1 million? Something's gone cuckoo, you know.
Peter, you really were a political activist, and you seem to find a way to express that as becoming a musical attraction. Your songs, gee, so many of them had a message. Where have all the flowers gone? I don't know if you wrote that, but I know that you guys recorded it. Dylan's Blowing in the Wind, and you recorded it and played it beautifully. I mean, you were so much more than Puff the Magic Dragon. That's sweet, but your songs, a lot of them, they tug at the heart, not even messages. If I listen to 500 Miles, when Mary Travers sings that, she just grabs me. That's something filled with sensitivity. The wedding song, which I believe was a gift from Paul to you at your wedding?
Well, no, Paul Stuckey wrote the wedding song for me. He was my best man at my wedding. The song, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, was written by Pete Seeger. There were many, many songs that the group wrote and sang, and many of them, and this was our tie to the Weavers, were focused on making a connection between peoples whose hearts said, we have to end this unjust war in Vietnam. You know, and then you see that what characterized the group, and that's probably what kept us together, was that we didn't think of our music basically as entertainment. Although we knew that it was engaging, it was, when people walked away from the concerts, you wouldn't hear them saying, oh man, did I have a fun night out? They would say, I was so moved, or they say something to the effect that I have to examine who I am, what I'm doing in the world. I have a responsibility to do my part to make the world a less dangerous, a less unfair place. And thousands of people have come up to me, and I'm sure to Mary and to Noel, saying, you were the soundtrack of my consciousness.
Wow.
You know, you inspired me to get involved.
Fabulous.
And we got that from Pete Seeger and the Weavers. Mary used to call us Seeger's Raiders. And we got it from their hearts, because Mary used to say, if you're going to sing, folk music says, if you're going to sing me, you have to live me.
Wow.
So this was, you know, people wonder, well, how could they be together almost 50 years?
Amazing.
Well, because we had a sense of mission.
It's also clear that you like each other. You could feel that when you
We
watch
did
your
not like
performance.
each other at all.
I take it back.
No, we loved each other. We loved each other.
Okay,
And that doesn't mean that you like each other all the time.
that's true.
If you have any deep relationship
Right.
with somebody, whether it's your spouse or your...
Could be your mother. You have an argument with your
That's
mother.
right. If there's intimacy, there's going to be conflict. And there was conflict.
That's right.
But there was something that pulled us together that transcended that conflict. And whether it was a part of the civil rights movement, if Mary were alive today, Noel and Mary and I together would have, you know, would be, to the degree possible, right there in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
You know, I just the other night did a performance at a church with some peace poets. Amazing performance.
Wow.
That are a tour for Black Lives Matter. This is not a matter of the past. If in just very recent years, I was up in Madison, Wisconsin. You know, when Scott Walker said, "Oh, if I could handle those protesters, myself and others singing, "This land is your land," and blowing in the wind and whatever, I can handle ISIS by implication. I mean, because he was destroying, or he's trying to destroy, on a nationwide basis, the essence of what made this country great, the greatest nation, when collective bargaining was allowed to members of the union. And that's today, that's not reminiscence.
It's not reminiscent, but also at that time you stood for more than just an independent issue. You came out against Vietnam. We had a friend in common that we lost 2 years ago at 95 years old, named Sid Bernstein.
Right.
And Peter, I believe that you and Sid produced a concert as a statement against Vietnam at the Garden. Is that correct?
Well, actually, there were two concerts that we produced together. One of them was at Madison Square Garden, and the occasion of it was the 18-year-old vote when it came into being. Prior to the 18-year-old vote, you couldn't vote until you were 21, which was judged to be crazy, because here you could go and lose your life in the United States, but you couldn't vote. So 18-year-old vote became the law, and the presumption was that those who were between 18 and 21, particularly those who were facing the draft, would be anti-war. And the country had already shifted in its overall perspective. The signal moment for that was at the March on Washington on October 18th, 1969. There was a march for 500,000 people that I co-organized with Cora Weiss. And that was mostly music. And that, you see, music was a political statement in those days.
More so than now.
Oh, well, there is music that's a political statement, but you don't hear it because music is so commercialized and so commodified that the people who run the record companies, instead of being people who love music, are basically accountants.
Yeah, that's right.
And their bottom line is the money that is made. Whereas in the era of the 1960s and 70s, there were extraordinarily gifted people who were heading record companies, who had enormous taste and passion and love of music and love of what the music did in the world. I mean, you don't see them nurturing the new Bob Dylans of our time.
Oh, there aren't any.
Well, they exist, but they're not in the commercial music world.
Peter, you were in an area where, I mean, you have so much competition. You're doing folk songs, and then Mamas and the Papas did maybe folk rock, but now there are the Beatles out there that just hit like a tornado in 1964, and you guys held your own. You continued. You remained successful.
Well, we actually had a second peak when we had the song "Leaving on a Jet Plane."
Did John Denver write that song?
He wrote that song, and John Denver was an unknown when we recorded the song.
69, something like that.
67, I think we recorded.
Right.
But Bob Dylan was an unknown when we recorded his song.
Amazing.
Gordon Lightfoot was an. We were not looking for hit songwriters. We were looking for songs that moved us, and so we were always on the side of the new singer-songwriters. There were many, and some became world famous and some less so.
Right.
But I had a great passion at that time, and still do, for the support of singer-songwriters who, I believe, if they're writing from the heart, can really move people and engage them in such a way that it does help to create the kind of spirit, the kind of empathy, the kind of compassion that is desperately needed in our world.
It sure is.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you're a performer. Sid was that type of a man as a presenter and promoter. He was a very compassionate, not a money guy. I mean, and he did some nice things himself with the Beatles. That concert, you sell out Madison Square Garden. You had huge names: Peter, Paul, and Mary, the Rascals.
No. We didn't have the Rascals at that. We had them at Shea Stadium. At that concert, we had Jimi Hendrix, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Harry Belafonte, the Voices of East Harlem, and myself.
Wow.
And that was it. Maybe there was another artist there, but it certainly wasn't the Rascals. The concert that was huge at Shea Stadium was also an anti-war concert. And that one included 20 different acts, including Janis Joplin, the Rascals, Paul Simon, the cast of Hair, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Steppenwolf.
I want a ticket. I'm going. I want a ticket.
Yeah, no, it was a huge organizing task, and
Did you guys sell out? Was it a full house?
no, it wasn't a full house, but it made its mark. Put it that way. You know that concert really showed the scope and the breadth of the musicians who were opposing the war. And that was very important then for music to stand up for this commitment. This
That's
was an
fabulous.
unjust war. We knew 5 years before it was over that from McNamara's writings and the documentary The Fog of War, that he had said to the president, there's no way to win this war. We were continuing because the president didn't want to be the first president to preside over the United States losing a war. Well, we haven't won a war since then. You know, war is an anachronism in many ways.
Yeah.
You know, our response to the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center was to declare war on who? You know, there was no connection between Saddam Hussein and the perpetrators of the World Trade Center tragedy.
You know, you guys, you really
It's like
were-
saying, we got to punch somebody, so let's, and then look at the mess that's been created in the Middle East since then. It was a disaster. So essentially, we needed to bind our hearts together in all these issues, whether it was the women's movement, anti-apartheid, whether it was anti-war, whether it's pro sustainable climate. And in today's world, we're looking at an extraordinary challenge. And in that regard, for instance, my daughter is a very, very active leader in the anti-fracking movement, and the climate change movement. You know, we saw President Obama come up with some really important regulations that he could do by executive order and is obliged to do because of the danger to the United States and the rest of the world.
Now, you guys were really a voice in the 60s. I mean, I'm one of the guys you helped because when my draft number came up, there was no more draft in 73. And that happened. President Nixon did it, I think, as a response to what was happening in the country. And you being the voice of that. And the Beatles, too. The Beatles came, and, you know, John Lennon's Give Peace a Chance. I mean, seemed that all the bands come together. united against what they felt was wrong, and you have a fellow like me and my age, and we benefited from it. We didn't go to Vietnam because of people like you, so thank you. But question, did you ever do anything with President Kennedy? Because you guys were having hit records in the early 60s.
Yeah, we did. We performed at the National Guard Armory with. It was a huge audience, and we were very, very young at the time. And where there was Gene Kelly was performing there. Joan Sutherland was an extraordinary opera singer. Carol Burnett was there, and Yves Montand, who's an amazing actor from France. And after the performance, where we sang Lemon Tree, which was our first hit, and If I Had a Hammer, we went to the vice president's home, and there was a gathering at which we were asked to sing after dinner, and there was no vice president's official residence, so it was Lyndon Johnson's home. And everybody stood around, and we sang. Mary sang 500 Miles. She was Noel, Paul, Stuckey, and I had rented tuxedos. Mary had bought her first evening gown, a white evening gown, floor length, and she sang 500 Miles, and everybody's jaws dropped.
Fabulous song.
They never, well, it's the way she sang it.
Yeah.
As David Halberstam, who used to live in this building, said, she sounded like she was saying, not only can't I go home because I don't have a shirt on my back, I am yearning for the United States, for my country, to return to being a moral nation.
Wow.
Yes, because there was that kind of yearning in her voice and in her persona. So we were singing that song, and then everybody was standing there, and I said, this is called folk music. I mean, it was pretty much unknown at the time. I guess this was 1961, if I'm not mistaken. So I said, and ordinarily when it's sung, the singers stand up, but everybody else sits on the floor. And immediately the president sat down on the floor.
Wow.
And everybody followed. And we sang for about a half an hour or so. And it completely just... I remember we had just begun singing Puff the Magic Dragon. And at the end, the whole party just became a real party.
Wow.
Jackie stayed late. The band stopped playing Lester Lennon kind of music, started playing the twist. Carol Burnett and I were twisting, and Gene Kelly and the president rolled back the rug and sang The Wearing of the Green.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was quite a scene. And I remember there was a conversation that he had with me and Noel Paul, where he said, that second song you sang, referring to If I Had a Hammer, the audience had an extraordinary response to it. Why was that? Tell me about that song. And we said, Noel said, it was a hit, it was a single. He said, what's a single? He said, it's a small round record with the hole in the middle. And Noel said, the president, oh, I know what you mean. I just don't get a chance to listen to the radio much while driving to work anymore. Right.
Peter, Puff, what year did that, I think that is probably your most legendary or your signature song, although you've had so many like the Beatles, it becomes endless. You wrote that, if I'm correct.
I did with a friend when I was a senior at Cornell, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's almost more of a standard for children. I don't know any little kid that does not love that song, and then the big kids become the little kids when we hear it being sung. It sounds like something that just came to you and flowed from the pen.
Well, and actually, it started with Lenny Lepton, who was exam time in 1959. I was a senior, he was a junior. And he came to my apartment in College Town at Cornell. And he sat down on the typewriter and he typed. He had been reading some Ogden Nash, and he just wrote this poem that became the basis of the song. It was an incomplete lyric, but I took it and I added lyrics and framed it as a song and wrote a melody. But he was so focused on exams that he left the piece of paper in the typewriter, and I saw it when I got home. So I can't claim authorship for. I can only claim authorship for some of the words, and not the first basic words.
Amazing. Wow, Peter, you know, it's wonderful, and thank you for sharing with us your beautiful memories of what I think is a special time, not only in our nation's history, but in the entertainment and the music industry's history. I don't think you're going to get another era like the 60s. Peter, Paul, and Mary, Mamas and Papas, of course the Beatles, but all that other stuff as well. You were there, you were an important part of it. We thank you for your contributions to our enjoyment, and I want to thank you for sharing those memories with me and my audience today.
Well, I want to thank you and your audience.
You know, it's kind of auspicious, by the way, guys, that you're doing this interview today, because this is the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima.
That's right.
The 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act.
Right, and it's International Peace Day, and the Voting Rights Act that has been gutted by our Congress, you know, that was the signal piece of the civil rights movement to assure that blacks would be able to vote. And now we see new laws that are coming up all over the country that are meant to make it more difficult, if not impossible, for people of color to vote, with saying you have to have this kind of ID, you have to have this kind of, you have to vote within this period of time, which is more difficult for people who are on a very low wage. You know, I mean, many ways to try to eliminate this. As a matter of fact, I was just reading an article that in Florida, you know, a huge proportion of people who have a jail record are people of color, and because they live surrounded by these police, and in Florida, when they created a list of felons who shouldn't be able to vote, that was later shown that there were a large proportion of those were not legit. The majority of them were blacks, and the figures came out that 20 times as many people as the margin of presumed victory for Bush were prevented from voting that should not have. So in other words, that it was a fallacious victory. So, you know, these voting restrictions and the biases of them, you know, because in some states, if you have a felony, you can vote. In some states not, but there is every effort that is being made to prevent the vote being available to people of color in certain states.
We've got to really re-examine that. But I want to thank Peter again for joining me, but I just want to open on a high note. Next week, next Thursday, speaking of 50th anniversaries, it's the 50th anniversary of the night the Beatles played Shea Stadium, presented there by my friend and Peter's friend, Sid Bernstein. And we're going to have a reunion show. We're going to have Gene Cornish of the Rascals, who was there that night and also performed with Peter's show at Shea Stadium's Festival of Peace. Vince Calandra, who worked for Ed Sullivan, was there that night, and a couple of girls from the crowd who are going to share their memories and a lot of fun next Thursday, 3 o'clock, 50th anniversary of the night the Beatles played Shea Stadium. Thanks for coming.